I just had a very strong belief, man, there's got to be a way. I know God is still speaking. There's got to be a way that I can more regularly hear him. And there's got to be a way um, to be able to speak in a way that people can hear, to speak good news to a world that's in just absolute desperate need for it.
Welcome to Divine Revelations Unleashed. Can't believe we're already at episode 3 and appreciate all the support that you all have been giving towards the podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed the last 2 episodes. First one with me telling you about this new podcast that I launched. And then we had the honor and privilege of having Grace Wabuke Klein on the podcast, where we talked about the different seasons of life and how to find purpose in it, especially when these seasons come unexpectedly. And so on today's episode, in episode 3, we have our second guest on Divine Revelations Unleashed with Pastor Jay Kim. Pastor Jay Kim serves as a lead pastor at Westgate Church in the Silicon Valley in California, and he recently released his book, Listen, Listen, Speak, Hearing God and Being Heard in a Noisy World. So God's still speaking and we can hear him. The world's still listening and we can be heard. So I really hope that you enjoy this interview with Pastor Jay Kim, and you're going to be able to learn more about how to listen, speak. So I really hope that you enjoy this episode and that it provides value and helps develop and grow your faith in God and learn more about what faith looks like for me. And happy to have these awesome guests really add value and so to this podcast. So hope you enjoy this episode with Pastor Jay Kim. Well, Pastor Jay, thank you for being on the podcast. Really excited to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Cameron. Excited to talk to you.
Yeah, and also congratulations on your new book that just recently released.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's books are a labor of love, so always, nerve-wracking, but a joy to finally release it out into the wild. So
Yeah, awesome. And for those listening, Pastor Jay Kim just came out with a book, Listen, Listen, Speak, Hearing God and Being Heard in a Noisy World. And that's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode. So, Pastor Jay, one of the things that I wanted to start off with our conversation today is what is where did this stem from, the idea of this book? Because I think it is a amazing topic and amazing book to take a deep dive on. And we're recording this on the day of your book launch, which is pretty exciting.
yeah.
Um, what what was the heart behind this book, and where did this stem from?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of your listeners can probably relate to this, just especially in recent years. I have found myself really overwhelmed with noise. And that's literally true, as urbanization has moved more and more people out of sort of the sprawling rural lands of our country and much more so into really dense, city spaces and even like large suburban sprawls. And so there's literal noise, of course. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that literal audible noise has a way of distracting us and wiring us for distraction in a unique way. But coupled with that, and for me, even more significantly, I just found myself really overwhelmed with the noise of like social media and news media and my endless addiction to scrolling and the news feeds and the Twitter feeds and whatever else, or the X feeds, whatever you want to call it. And as a follower of Jesus, one of the most frustrating parts of that was that it felt like it was becoming increasingly difficult to hear the voice that I want to hear most, which is the voice of God. And then on the other side of it, I just found myself unable to speak in a way that I felt like was being heard. I just felt like every time I had something to say, it was just contributing to the to the chaos, of everybody shouting and screaming at each other. So I began going on a journey, asking that question. I just had a very strong belief, man, there's got to be a way. I know God is still speaking. There's got to be a way that I can more regularly hear him. And there's got to be a way um, to be able to speak in a way that people can hear, to speak good news to a world that's in just absolute desperate need for it. So that was the real sort of like longing and desire in me that led to all sorts of reading and prayer and practices, which turned into this book.
Awesome. I really like how you talk about noise because there is so much noise today in the world that we live in, and there's more noise, and the noise just gets louder and louder and louder, and it's really an inhibitor in us in listening and hearing God. So how do we control the noise in the world that we live today? Because I think that's where I wanted to start the conversation before we talk about listening and hearing God is how do we control the noise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess my initial thought is I actually think it's not worth our time and energy to try to control the noise. The
Mm,
reality is we live in a noisy world. The last 10 years or so in the past decade amongst American adults, media consumption, media of any kind, social media, news media, whatever, media consumption has increased 20%. In the year 2011, the average person spent 45 minutes a day on their phone. Today, the average American spends more than 4 hours a day on their phone. The average smartphone user physically touches their phone more than 2,600 times a day. So really, that's the stuff we can control. It's not so much that we can turn the volume up or down on noise as a whole. What we can do, though, I'm wearing AirPods right now to have this podcast conversation, and the reality is, like when we're done, I will take the AirPods out. And even on these AirPods, there's like the noise cancellation feature. When I go to the gym and I put these AirPods on, the gym can be kind of a loud place, but I like listening either to calm music or maybe to a podcast while I'm running on the treadmill. And I will often do the noise cancellation. And when I do, it's not that I've controlled the noise around me. It's that I have calibrated my own listening experience to drown that noise out. And I think in our spiritual lives, there's a way to do that. So again, going back to some of that data, we don't have to consume more media. We can, with discipline, we can begin to consume less. We don't have to spend 4 hours a day on their phones, sort of mindlessly, endlessly scrolling and swiping and clicking and liking. We don't have to do that. We can spend way less time on our phones, and there's a way in which we can, incorporate particular practices and disciplines in our lives that help us to do more and more of that. We don't have to touch our smartphones and open them and unlock them 2,600 times a day. We don't have to do those things. And so that's a way in which we can, to your point, kind of like control the noise. Not that we control how much noise there is in the world, that's beyond us, but we can control how much of it we choose to consume, how much of our attention we give to it. And I think that's probably the first step in learning to live a listening life.
Yeah, I think that's often a challenge that we're facing today is with technology and the distractions that we have it just in the palm of our hands. It almost can be a way that we're either seeking validation or affirmation through those means.
Yeah.
And when it's really that God, the one that created us, is the one that affirms us and says we are chosen, like
Yep.
we are here for a purpose. And
Yep.
oftentimes you just people just consume themselves. I'm one to do this too, is consume myself hours and hours in just my devices, and these distraction can be consuming and become very noisy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why most of us feel overwhelmed, honestly. If you look at the stats on rates of anxiety, they're just skyrocketing since about 2012, particularly amongst teenagers. The social psychologists, Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, have done a lot of work on this. You can just Google their names and you'll see it. But it's not coincidental that 2012 was right around the time when smartphones became ubiquitous, pervasive in culture. And that was also the time when social media began to expand. Instagram was on the rise. It's when we first began putting smartphones in the hands of teenagers. And you just see this very strong correlation in a very sharp spike in rates of anxiety, feelings of depression and loneliness. And I think there's enough data that bears this out. Like that's not coincidental. We are drowning in the chaos, drowning in the noise. And so the path forward is to recalibrate and reorient our desires and our longings and our rhythms and our habits to be able to create space for quiet, and for even silence, to be able to achieve the sort of clarity I think we all need to be able to hear the voice of God, who, like you said, is the voice of love, someone who made us for a purpose and longs to be with us.
I think silence is a real challenge and difficult habit to try to practice because we have all this noise in our day-to-day world, the hustle and bustle of just life in general. And
Yeah.
like for me, complete silence is the most uncomfortable thing.
Yeah.
It's because you when your mind is going and going and going, and then you have to slow down, and you don't
Yeah.
make that time to slow down and really have that peace, that silence. It's very uncomfortable. What Pastor Jay, why is having that time of silence so important for us to have as a practice, something to practice or something in to bring into our lives?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research that shows that the term multitasking, that phrase was invented when computer processors were being developed. So basically, that idea, the word multitasking it originated from technology where we were creating computer processors that could multitask, that could do multiple things all at the same time. And then very very quickly over time we took that idea and we began mapping it on ourselves, that like if computers could multitask, you know what, we can multitask. But actually there's a lot of neuroscience that's revealing multitasking is actually not a function of the human brain. Like human beings can't actually multitask. I know many of us listening right now are like, what are you talking about, Jay? I multitask all the time. I'm multitasking right now, listening to this conversation and doing the dishes, and also sort of thinking about the next meeting I have to go to or whatever. What science is revealing to us is you're not actually multitasking. The human mind cannot do that. What you are doing is switching. You are switching very quickly from scrubbing like scrubbing the dishes to paying attention to this next sentence that I'm going to say on this podcast to then in a moment thinking about like the next meeting you're going to go to. You're not multitasking. Your brain is actually just firing on all cylinders, switching very quickly from one thing to another, which gives you the perception that you are multitasking. But the brain is a muscle, and all of that switching is actually incredibly taxing. It's like curling dumbbells, like to a certain extent, you can do that for a while, but at a certain point, like the benefit of it becomes far outweighed by the detriment. If you just keep, lifting nonstop, your muscles, they don't get stronger, they begin to over time deteriorate. And because you have to give them rest. And I think that's what silence is. It's a part of that. It's the ability to stop your brain from switching and to sit in the quiet for a while and focus our attention, our mental and emotional energies for the long haul on one particular thing. And it is very uncomfortable because it's not the way we typically live. Like our minds and our hearts are not accustomed anymore to sitting for a long time, focusing our attention on one particular thing, or even on no particular thing, and just creating space. But again, what the research shows is that that is when the most creative and meaningful parts of human experience come to life. And we see this throughout scriptures. I mean, just read the Psalms time and time again. The psalmists are writing about finding their shelter in the shadow of God's wings and in his presence, this sort of like really focused, embodied attention on God's love for us. And again, in a noisy world, I think, for followers of Jesus, it's one of the things we need most to stop switching from thing to thing to thing, to stop, believing the lie of multitasking, and to sit in the quiet for a while and focus the entirety of our attention on the presence of God, the loving presence of a God who is always with us, that we can tap into, and is totally accessible if we would just give it the time and energy to heighten our awareness of his presence in our lives. And silence is a path to doing that.
Yeah, and you look at the life of Jesus, he modeled it the best. Is
That's right.
even though he was involved in so much, had a lot of things going on, he was leading the 12 disciples, but he still made that time for solitude, retreat, rest, and prayer. And all of that really helped him uh, lead lead the 12 disciples and um, be able to spend time with God and in prayer.
That's right. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Well said.
The next, yeah. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is listening, and I think this is a, difficult trait. I think many people have that I encounter on a just a day to day because man, people can talk. People can talk. They can talk, and oftentimes that they don't have that trait for listening,
Mm.
like listening to what the other person is saying. Why do you think that is today? It's such an issue that I see a lot. Is uh, sometimes it's just talking and there's no listening going on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the title of the book is Listen, Listen, Speak. Some people are like, oh, yeah, 2 ears, one mouth. And that's certainly true. But
Hmm.
really, the title of the book is Listen, Listen, Speak, because it's just been a helpful mantra for me. What I mean is, I found myself in recent years in conversation with people, even in meaningful, important conversation with people, the other party would be saying something, they would be talking, but while I am listening, my what I'm doing actually is mentally speaking. I'm crafting a response to whatever it is they're saying. So what they are saying, I found myself just seeing it as sort of like background noise or the sort of apparatus around which I could then craft whatever it is I wanted to speak. And so it's so simple, but I started telling myself this mantra, when I'm engaged in conversation with God or with people, what I want to do is listen in order to listen and then speak, you know? And I think that's a temptation for all of us. I don't think it's just because of the cultural moment we're in, although, like, again, a noisy world has hyper accelerated that temptation to just listen for the sake of speaking. Um, but I think, uh, there's a psychologist who wrote a book, M. Scott Peck wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. And he actually says attention is, I'm paraphrasing him, but he says that attention, like real focused attention, is one of the greatest expressions of love that we can give to another person. And again, for followers of Jesus, like we live to learn and live the way of Jesus. And put very simply, the way of Jesus is the way of love. And so if we are people of love, and we are, that is what followers of Jesus are called to be, then what that means is we are people who are called to give the gift of our attention to others because it is one of the highest forms of giving our love, to give people our embodied, focused attention. And so that's why listening matters so much. Listening not for the sake of like just responding and reacting, but listening in order to listen, to really give the gift of our attention so that through the other person's words, we might, receive and hold their story with care and empathy and love. And I think that's just a lost art in our world today. And I grieve that, but I think there's a path forward.
Mm. I think it's also a mindset thing too, is when you're in conversation. I've been very challenged with this, especially podcasting for about 3, 4 years now. It's even while we're talking, I'm thinking of a response, but I've really learned because I've been able to get around so many leaders through this podcasting world, such as yourself, Pastor Jay, and like focusing on what you are saying,
Mm,
and soaking it in rather than trying to uh, devise a response or think about what's next. It's such a difficult trait, and it's like it's I think it's more of a mindset of um, like how can I add value to this conversation? What and then also receive it back. It's like okay, taking it all and just soaking it all in rather
mm,
than trying to be that loud voice in the
yeah,
conversation.
yeah. Yeah, and it's not to say that we should never speak. It's not to say that we should never respond. I think the point I'm trying to make is that our words are not the primary gift. Our responses are not the primary gift we give to one another. It is, again, it is our attention. Our attention is the most important gift we have to give each other. And
Mhm.
that's, again, it's kind of a lost art in our world. And I hope we can recapture it.
Exactly. And the key is to make everyone feel heard as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
And that's actually what I wanted to transition to next because hearing God is something that you always hear in the church.
Mm,
And in our audiences, young people, probably new people of faith, people in college, or some people are exploring faith. And often you hear this term in the church, oh, I heard God say this.
mm,
But one of the things that even I'm challenged with as I sit here with you today is how do you really hear God?
mm. Yeah. I mean, that is the question, right? That's one of the
Hmm.
questions that, again, motivated me toward this book. There's this 20th century Scottish pastor, not well known, but he wrote this small little book called A Diary of Daily Prayer. His name's John Bailey. And he opens the book with this beautiful line. He says, it's a prayer. The whole book is a series of prayers. And he has this beautiful prayer. It's really simple but profound for me. He says, let my first thought be of you. Let my first impulse be to worship you. Let my first word be your name. Let my first action be to kneel before you in prayer. And the reason it's simple, it's beautiful, but the reason that line, those ideas have been so helpful is that for most of us, when we say we want to hear God, what we really mean, if you just kind of unpack that desire for most of us, not all of us, but most of us, what we mean is we want to hear God when we think we need to hear God. Like
Mm,
we do our own thing, we live our life, we give our attention to a variety of other voices, and then we arrive at a place where there's a dilemma or a situation or circumstance that's challenging, we're uncertain, we're unsure. And in those moments, we're like, okay, God, I need you to speak. But really, I think there's a lot more to this. But one of the best ways, one of the most effective ways to hear God is to think about his voice as the primary voice, not to go listening for his voice when we think we need it, but to live life attuned and aware of his voice that is speaking all the time, and then to listen to every other voice as sort of commentary to the primary voice, which is the voice of God. The writer and philosopher Dallas Willard, he's got this wonderful line. He says that our failure to hear God's voice when we want to is due to the fact that we do not in general want to hear it, that we want it only when we think we need it. And that's the problem. It's one of the primary problems. In my life, I have found that the most effective way to hear the voice of God is to wake up every morning and suppress all the other noise and tune my ears to the voice of God that is already speaking, not because I wake up with the sense that like, oh, there's this situation or that problem and I need God to speak, but to wake up in the morning and to go to bed every night saying, God, the first voice I want to hear and the last voice before I lay down to sleep is your voice. And what that does is it acclimates and sort of almost rewires our hearts and minds to tune into the frequency of his voice that is speaking all the time. And really, the goal is not volume. It's not, I want God's voice to like shout above all the other noise. The key is clarity. It's almost like, we don't use radios anymore, but like if you think back, those who are old enough and those who are not old enough, there was a thing called radio. And way back when I was a little kid, there would be these little dials with numbers, and you would like literally turn the dial and it would go across these numbers and it would be static until it got right to the correct frequency. And then there would be clarity. And that's what we need to do. Like we need to turn the knob, not the volume knob, but like the frequency knob of our lives to get right where our hearts and minds and our ears and our like all of our beings are attuned to the frequency of God's voice to hear it clearly. There's noise everywhere else, but we are attuned to the frequency of God's voice in all things. And then we begin to hear all the other noise through the filter of the voice of God. And for me, again, there's much more to say about this, but for me, that's been one of the most helpful practices in hearing the voice of God through the noise.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to spending time with God and having that intimate time with God. Because if we are not spending time in the Word, spending time with God as we would in because really what faith is, it's a relationship with God. And
That's right.
if we're not spending time with Him or getting to know Him better, then how are we going to hear Him?
Yep.
And it's not only until we have that, and I think it's different for everyone. You find your devotion time, whatever that might look like, but making sure you make that a priority in your day to day as you walk in faith.
Yeah, that's it. Well said. Agreed.
So what are some practical ways, people might have questions on, I haven't heard from God. What are some small steps that people can take to really start even going in that direction of hearing from God?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first practical things I would say, again, in a noisy world, a very like media saturated world, I think we need to probably sort of reverse our intake diet. Often, we sort of attune our ears, again, the frequency, we attune our ears to media and we consume media, and then that media begins to consume us. It leads to like panic and anxiety, and then we react to that. Sometimes that leads to just rage. We find that we live in an outrage culture, and to sort of find relief from that rage, we just consume some more, and that cycle continues on and on. I think we need to figure out a way to like to completely undo that rhythm and instead live sort of a prayer cycle of a listening life. We need to think about all of our media intake as supplemental and instead begin to intake, like you said, scripture and prayer. Prayer is not just like folding your hands and praying for 30 seconds before you eat your meal. Prayer can be a way of life. It's not necessarily even always talking. It's like a prayerful listening. And so throughout all of life, we can attune ourselves to the presence of God with a prayerful posture, like, Lord, here I am, I'm listening. And instead of reacting, we can prayerfully reflect on whatever it is happening before us in our lives and in the world. And then instead of, like being overwhelmed by rage, we can respond prayerfully. And so that's like one simple idea. I get into it much more in the book in terms of the pragmatics of it, but things like that. And those types of like simple practices that are reorientations of our lives and what we give our attention to, they're accessible and they're available to us. They're all around us. And we just need to begin to, again, reorient and rehabituate our lives toward listening lives instead of media saturated lives.
Mm. Well, awesome. Final question before we go into a little of a rapid fire round as we wrap up this conversation. What is it that you really hope that readers get out of this book? And also, what are some ways that people can get a copy of your book, Listen, Listen, Speak?
Yeah. Man, my hope is just that people would begin to experience the peace and the settledness of a listening life, and that they would experience the incredible transformative presence of God that is closer than they can possibly imagine, even right now. And that they might, through what they learn in the book, um, begin to instill some practices in their lives that, again, help them to live with a deep awareness of God, who is always speaking. So yeah, people can grab the book wherever they get their books, Amazon, online, somewhere. You can just Google it, J. Kim, Listen, Listen, Speak, and I'm sure it'll pop up all sorts of different places where you can find the book.
Awesome. And you also have a podcast yourself that you just started.
Yeah, yeah. We just wrapped up our first full season of a podcast called The Digital Examine. It's kind of in this world where I'm just talking to friends and leaders and writers and pastors who are living listening lives, deeply examining their lives. So that whole season is out and available wherever people get their podcasts.
Yeah, I've enjoyed tuning in and hearing from the unique guests that you brought on to
Mm,
share their insights. So that's
that's
been
awesome.
really awesome. So, wanted to go into a rapid fire of questions just to get to know you a little bit more. One of the questions that I actually did not have on here that came to mind is, what is your favorite Bible verse?
Oh my gosh. That is a great question. It's hard to say I have a favorite one.
One that speaks to you the loudest.
Oh goodness. Huh. Yeah. Well, the one that is probably most formative for me is the invitation of Jesus at the end of Matthew's gospel to go and make disciples of all nations. And the only reason I say that is because my whole ministry life, especially in recent years, has found such a groundedness in that very clear call that that's why I'm here. That's why we're here, to be disciples of Jesus and to join God in the work of helping form men and women into followers of Jesus, disciples, students, apprentices who are learning and living the way of Jesus in all of life. So I don't know that it's my favorite necessarily, but it is the anchor verse of my life to go and,
Mm,
and make disciples of all nations.
awesome. What are some of the things you do to help grow your faith?
Oh, goodness. I've talked about a lot of it here. Create space to listen to the voice of God, scripture, prayer, the local church. Um, yeah, and I don't even necessarily know that I would use the phrase grow my faith. I really do believe in the invitation of God by his Spirit to just join him in the lifelong, and it is lifelong, the lifelong process of just being formed every single day more and more into his likeness. And honestly, in my life, it's a series of starts and stops, and two steps back, one step forward, one step back, three steps forward. It's all of that, but God is faithful, and so yeah, there you go.
Awesome. And next question is, what is one thing that continues to challenge you in your journey of faith?
Everything, everything is challenging. There is no one thing. All of life, yeah, but I think beautiful, meaningful things in life are always challenging. They're never easy.
Awesome. Next question is, what is one piece of advice you can provide to the next generation of believers?
Your identity is already secure. It's not built on what culture tells you matters. It's built on the fact that, as the psalmist tells us in Psalm 139, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And Jeremiah 1, God formed you and knew you before you were in your mother's womb. And so your
Mm,
identity is secure, and you can do all that you do in your life from that place of security.
yeah, that's great. And final question is, what is your hope for the future of the church?
that we continue on the journey that we've been on for 2,000 years to faithfully be the bride of Christ and be a good news people for a world in need.
Awesome. Well, Pastor Jay, thank you so much for this awesome conversation. And again, congratulations on your new book. For those that are looking to get a copy of the book, you can find the links in the podcast description. And also, Pastor Jay, how can people connect with you on social media as well?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Cameron. It's fun
Yeah.
chatting with you. You can just find me online. jkimthinks.com is my website. And that's also my, Instagram and X, Twitter, Facebook, all of that, jkimthinks. And would be happy to connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Pastor Jay, for your time. And to all those that are listening and watching, get a copy of the book. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast interview with Pastor Jay Kim. And if you would like to connect with Pastor Jay Kim, check out the podcast that he co-hosts. He just wrapped up the first season of a podcast series that he's co-hosting with Barna. And also, if you want to get a copy of his brand new book, Listen, Speak, Hearing God and Being Heard in a Noisy World, you can find that wherever books are sold. And I've dropped the links on the podcast description on whichever platform you're listening on, so you can easily access that. Then you can connect with Pastor Jay on social media, and all those links are there as well. And so I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you want to connect further, you can find the social media links for Divine Revelations Unleashed. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and also Facebook. So you can find the social media links there as well. Search Divine Revelations Unleashed. And really excited to really launch out this new podcast and have some awesome guests. And really hope that you enjoyed this episode, and also go back if you haven't listened to some of the previous episodes as well with Grace Wabuke Klein, and then episode 1 as I introduce what the podcast is all about and a little flavor about my faith journey. So thank you so much, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and feel free to make some comments on either social media or whichever platform you're listening on to help support this. So thank you again, and we'll catch you next week on a brand new episode of Divine Revelations Unleashed. Thank you.